Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life After Deconstruction podcast. I'm super excited to share my very first episode with you. It's a discussion that I had with my dear friend, Britt Hartley. Britt is a scholar, an author, a podcaster, a blogger, a spiritual director, and like I said, a dear friend. In this episode, we talk about and unpack the meaning of deconstruction from a scholarly and academic, philosophical type of standpoint, as well as how there's been an attribution of meaning to the word deconstruction in the faith transition, faith crisis type space. I hope you enjoy the episode. I'd like to introduce you to my friend Britt Hartley today, and we're going to talk about deconstruction and the meaning that we attribute to deconstruction, and what is there any value in deconstructing things. So to start with, I'd ask you, Britt, to introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners today.
All right. Hi, my name is Britt Hartley. I'm a spiritual director with the Center for Non-Religious Spirituality, is where I got my certification for that. And I have a master's degree in the future of American spirituality. And I just love exploring these topics with good friends like you, Anthony. And I podcast with Bill Reel over at Almost Awakened. So that's where I spend a lot of my time hanging out.
I love your work over there. In fact, of all the work that I've done so far, I think one of the ones that I most enjoy pointing people to is the series that we did on the Jack Kornfield audiobook, Buddhism for Beginners, and the conversations that we had about that book. One of my favorites.
Definitely one of my favorites.
All right, so let's jump in. One thing that a lot of people, I think, automatically assume is that they know what it means to deconstruct. And so I wanted to talk about a kind of a scholarly academic attribution of meaning to deconstruction. The term, if you look on Wikipedia, the term refers to an approach of recognizing that language is imprecise in how we attribute meaning to things. And deconstruction is generally thought of as a process of textual criticism, literary criticism, to really get to the underneath of what was meant by the words that were used in books, literature, philosophy, humanities, anthropology, law, linguistics, LGBTQ studies, feminism, and other kinds of things. So it's a scholarly effort to unpack the meaning of those kinds of things. And there are people that think it's a great process, and there are other people that don't like it as a process. There's the postmodernist who tend to like deconstruction. There are those who are very skeptical of postmodernism and so forth. So in any event, generally from an academic standpoint, that is the meaning that we attribute to the word deconstruction. Do you have thoughts about that you'd like to share before we get into our next question?
Yeah, so I studied a little bit, in my master's degree, how this kind of all started for us, because we're in a postmodern age. When historians talk about our time period, they'll call us the postmodern age. And really what that means, and it started in the 60s with really in the literature department, where we used to believe that there was ultimate reality and language reflected ultimate reality. And the more that we really started to dig into all the texts that, humanity has produced, we came to realize that it was the other way around, that language was the thing that kind of created reality. And then also attached to that was power structures. And so it's really the first time in human history where we have enough history to look at and enough perspective to be able to say, what is actually going on here, right? And because we're seeing in history, there'll be one power structure and there'll be a certain amount of language that supports that power structure. And then eventually that power structure crumbles. And then there's a new power structure with a new kind of language of this is what's true and this is what's real and this is the structure and the order of things. And for the first time as a society in human history, we've been able to step back and say, okay, It seems to be, we just, these power structures just rise and fall, and the language kind of goes with it. Maybe we don't know as much as we think we do. What is actually, going on here at the base level? And so that started really in the 60s with literature. And then it kind of got into all the other subjects, like you mentioned. And it's really this stance of stepping back and say, okay, there's 4,000 gods now to worship. There's 10,000 gods that have already died. Each of them have their own kind of language that supports whatever that belief system is. And instead of getting sucked into them, it's that step back where we say, what is actually going on here? And so it's super interesting, and it's happening in really all subjects. And we can talk about whether that's a good or bad thing. The reality is that it just is, right? It is happening. And so across society, we're talking about, well, what really is gender? What really is sexuality? What really is God? What is really happening in our brains when we talk about God? These institutions, do they need to be here? Why are they here? What purposes do they serve? And so we're just having the opportunity for the first time in human history to just take that step back and start asking deeper questions about what's going on.
Wow, that is amazing. I know why I invited you to this conversation today.
I will nerd out with you anytime.
Perfect.
Anytime.
Yeah. So the next thing that I've witnessed in terms of this more scholarly attribution of meaning to deconstruction is that it tends to be very threatening to those power structures that you mentioned. That there's argument over what meanings of words are. There's arguments over what is the intent of things like laws or constitutions, or what was the intent of writers of scriptures and things like that. And it seems to be threatening, like I said, to the power structures. What comments do you have about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. For deconstruction, one of the fears, and I think it's a well-founded fear, and it usually comes from kind of the right, politically or theologically, kind of the more conservative side, but I think it's a fair point, is that if we deconstruct everything, what are we as humans, and do we have free will, and are we even a self, and what is sexuality, and what is morality? And if we deconstruct it all and essentially tear down all institutions and all sense of order and all sense of structure that kind of holds up society and allows us to kind of live communally with other humans, the risk there is that you're tearing down things that we need or that society needs. And we don't know for sure that the power vacuum that creates, what comes next, we don't know if that'll necessarily be better than what we have, right? So if you tear down the concept of America, for example, which, yes, it's a total myth. The idea that, this blob of dirt belongs to America and it has this story and manifest destiny and the whole thing. And then this blob of dirt is, Mexico and it has a different story. Of course it's a myth, right? We put that on it. And so let's say we just totally crumble that. Okay, that, there's a lot of really legitimate reasons to question governments and constitutions and institutions. And we're talking about the monarchy right now because the queen, just died. And the fear is, especially from the conservative side, is that there's some wisdom in these structures that allow us to relate and just have security and order as humans so that people can live fulfilling lives. And so the fear with deconstruction is that if we do it too much, too fast, without replacing it with something just as good or better, is it going to be healthy for us? Is it going to be good for our children? Is it going to give our children and grandchildren a better world? And so that is something to think about, because I don't think anyone truly knows the answer to that question, right? We're deconstructing, but we haven't started the hard process of reconstructing what we're deconstructing. We don't have kind of a unified plan for the questions that we're asking. And so that can lead to growth and new orders and better structures and better institutions. But we could also be throwing a lot of babies out with that bathwater that could be, really damaging. And so I do think that there is, I'm saying this as someone who tends to vote on the left just because of my own political values, but there is a lot of really good arguments on the right for doing this mindfully and doing this with some kind of safety or structure or something to replace it with. Otherwise, there is danger that really you're just replacing fundamentalism with nihilism, which we can talk about later. Yes, there are dangers to fundamentalism when things are too ordered, but when you have nothing, no sense of purpose, no structure, no ability to raise children as a community, when you lose all of that, then you get to nihilism, which is not any better. I mean, that's a completely different set of problems. And so I think it's something that we have to be aware of personally and as a community.
Yeah. So the listener probably is wondering why we're getting so deep into this. And I think it's because what we're talking about now is going to connect to how deconstruction works in terms of a faith deconstruction. So stay with us, even though we're getting deep into this. I would say that even today, I'm seeing people who you would traditionally see as being on the left, like Bill Maher with his HBO Real Time, that he's strongly criticizing a wokeism or a level of deconstruction that he perceives as going too far and becoming out of control or non-functional and so forth. So I think that it's not only people on the right that are concerned about deconstruction going too far, but even people on the left. At least that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, there are voices on the left who are calling out really the way that wokeism has become its own religion and the dangers of that, because then it just kind of becomes its own, it's a political crusade as much as, the Middle Ages was a religious crusade. And that has its own set of problems. But yeah, we have to be able to do this in a mindful way. Otherwise, we just become a religion of tearing everything down. And what is that leaving for our children, right?
Right. So the next question that I kind of want to unpack is, at some point, I don't know how long ago, whether it's in the last decade or two, or if it's before that, there's been this application of meaning or attribution of meaning to deconstruction as having to go through a faith crisis or a faith deconstruction, where a person is part of tending to be more of a conservative structure, a more fundamentalist, literalist interpretation of scriptures and power structures and gender roles and authority structures and so forth, and a more perhaps confined attribution of meaning to divinity and God and religion and country and so forth. And then for whatever reason, at some point during their life, they experienced some sort of crisis of faith, maybe a dark night of the soul, maybe without a dark night of the soul, but they experience a faith transition. And then there's this natural tendency that I've at least anecdotally seen, and what I see not only in Mormonism but in other types of faith traditions, is that after that crumbling, after the metaphorical shelves crash, there's this desire to deconstruct, at least that's the word that we use, to unpack, what did everything mean? And it tends to, for people that were in very enmeshed systems where their very sense of identity, their community, their roles, their reputation, their belonging, were all completely enmeshed with the meanings that were attributed to their belief systems, to their scriptures and things like that, it tends to be, for many people, a very traumatic experience. And so deconstruction is part of this experience of, at least the way we're using the word, to unpack a traumatic experience of experiencing an existential identity crisis as well as a faith crisis. And so I wanted to talk about or get your thoughts on the use of the word deconstruction that has this scholarly academic kind of meaning to this process or experience of trying to make sense of life when you experience an existential crisis. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts of that. Of that, I had to jot a few things down so I wouldn't forget. And there's multiple things going on here. And so, first of all, the process of kind of deconstructing and reconstructing is very natural. Our brains do it all the time. If you look at kind of what my child is learning in science class, they're given certain rules. Like I have a child in kindergarten, and so the rule is that birds fly. And we don't worry too much that that's not entirely true, right? Or that there's exceptions or there's more complexity to that. Because in that sphere where she is in kindergarten, the science or, the order of science that is most helpful for her at that age in understanding the world is that birds fly, right? And then as you go, like if you were into a science degree, by the time you're at a PhD in some scientific field, you've essentially deconstructed all the old orders of rules and kind of structure of processing of how to understand the world scientifically, and you've recreated those with increasing complexity. And that's a very normal process, and that can just go from one year of science to the next year to the next year as you are able to add more and more complexity and nuance. But what happens with religion is that oftentimes with religion, whatever you were taught as a kindergartner is kind of where it stops, right? And so you get stuck. And then on top of that, not only is there this kind of resistance to increasing, in complexity and nuance, but there's also, when you are building your faith framework, it's like a foundation of a house. So on top of that, you're putting, your beliefs in God and your meaning and purpose for life and how you raise your children and your friends in your family and your sense of morality and how you make decisions and your sense of self, and everything is built on that foundation. And so when you are not able to healthily go through kind of yearly deconstruct and reconstruct, that's natural for human development. What happens is you build an entire house on a foundation that you eventually outgrow and cracks and crumbles, and then the whole house comes down. And so that's what really creates, I think for me, I think that's why faith crisis really is so jarring and can be so just life altering for people, is because it's not just realizing, oh, that rule, birds fly, doesn't really apply here because there's this more complex rule. Because you weren't a part of that process, everything just kind of breaks. And so it's just this really big break in your development, and it takes a lot of time to reorient and kind of rebuild your spiritual home. So there's that going on personally, which I think is interesting because we build so much of the structure of our lives around our beliefs. And then we have society at large going through this, right? So people are leaving religion. There's a lot of reasons for that. From the studies, we find that people are finding God elsewhere, even if they believe in God. Politics in the 80s, especially when really Christianity became a political power in America, that caused people a lot of cognitive dissonance and asking questions about what does it really mean to be Christian, right? And so not only are we going through this personally, but as a society, we're also breaking down, what are these institutions really doing? When they're covering up sex scandals, for example, which a lot of the major churches have done, what does that say about them saying that we're Christian and we follow Jesus and we're trying to do what Jesus does, right? And so we have personal levels and we have communities that are leaving the church. And then we have the whole society, which is kind of deconstructing all kinds of institutions. The youth, for example, have a huge amount of distrust for all kinds of institutions, political and religious. And so it's just this kind of cultural zeitgeist that we're a part of. where we are deconstructing what all these very old church institutions have been telling us is the way to live life because it's not resonating with us. But we also as a society, haven't recreated, okay, then what next? And so that's kind of where we are in spirituality and religion right now in America. And you can see why it's not helping kind of the kids, because we're essentially, I don't think parents realize how much kids are getting their spirituality from tarot readers on TikTok. That's like the majority of their spirituality is tarot readers on TikTok for more kids than we think. And so it's this question of, okay, so what do we do next? If you don't want to show up and sit on a pew, how do churches respond to that? And how do we as a people, and how do you as a family, and how do we as a community rebuild all of these tools that religions have had, but just no longer apply to the modern world? And so that's just where we are. And it's I think what's so interesting for me, who spends a lot of time hanging out in this world, is that we don't know where that train is going. And so that makes it exciting for me. I want to see where this goes.
Yeah. One question that I have is, I remember when I was going through my faith deconstruction, when I was on the outside, it looked very threatening to my believing friends and family. It looked like criticism. It looked like, for some of them, it looked like that I wanted to tear it all down. I mean, there were times that I did feel the anger stage of grief, depression stage of grief. And there were times that I felt like I wanted to tear it all down, but it was part of my process of processing the experience of trauma, of existential crisis, of grief, and this process of trying to find what the underlying meaning is to things. It's to have my 1,000-piece puzzle shattered and then to decide what pieces I'm going to use. But it felt very, very threatening to believing friends and family along the way. And I can imagine that these things that you're referring to that are happening in the broader culture are feeling very, very, very threatening to the power structures, the institutions, the people who find meaning in those kinds of structures and so forth. And it doesn't seem like it's going away. People are going to continue to experience this deconstruction of attribution of meaning to faith and philosophy, belief, spirituality, and so forth. But it just feels very threatening. Is there a way around this? Is there a way to not have the power structures or the institutions not feel like this is an attack on them? I don't know if there's a way.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So there's two things I want to go into. So personally, when I'm dealing with someone one-on-one, what you have to realize is, I have a lot of clients who come to me and just say, like, why can't my mom hear my story? Why can't my mom really sit with me in this? I don't understand. She says she loves me. And when we really understand the brain, and let's say, you do have a spiritual home, it has all of the structure for how you live your life. When someone is deconstructing, it is threatening to their own spiritual home. They get a sense that if you walk into my spiritual home, you're going to tear something down. And when you tear something down, I'm going to have to face something very scary, right? Because what religions do at a psychological level is they really allow us to function in the face of human existential fears. So the four usually are fear of death, fear of meaninglessness, that I'm just a speck in the universe and no one cares, and so why do anything? Fear of isolation, that I'm alone, and fear of freedom. And the fear of freedom is an interesting one. That's the fear that no one else is responsible for my life but me. Like, not the planets, not God's path for me that he's laid out for me, not other people, that I actually am responsible for creating my own life in this world of gray and chaos. And, we just don't understand so much, right? And so when religion and your belief system is a protection against all of those fears. And you and I have both been to probably a Mormon funeral where no one is really grieving. all we do is we gather and we just tell the story. This person's with Jesus now, and we just be happy and we sing the songs and we bury them. And no one really grieves because we all have this belief system and we're all encouraging each other in this belief system that we don't have to grieve because that person's with Jesus now, right? So it's this kind of communal spiritual bypassing, emotional bypassing. And so what you have to do if that's where you are is that your ego has to protect that, because so people may not be able to verbalize this, but in the brain, what's going on is that the ego has to protect that belief system all the time. Otherwise, you're going to have to grieve your dad, or you're going to have to think about meaninglessness, or you're going to have to face questions that are really scary, that give you a lot of negative sensations, right? And so whenever you're talking to someone one-on-one and they feel threatened, it's really a sense of their ego is protecting them from things that are really scary. And I can understand that. As a human, I can understand that because I've been to those scary places and they are terrifying. There are places that I've been, dark nights of the soul, dark questions kind of places, that I understand why brains work so hard to avoid these places. They're very scary. You need resources. You need to be in a good place in your life to be able to tackle them. And so the only thing you can do when you're talking one-on-one is there a way that you could reach out to that person where the ego doesn't feel like it has to fight you so much, or else you're just not going to get anywhere. Anytime that you're talking to someone where their ego has to protect them, you're not going to get anywhere. And of course, the only way to do that is, the Queen Brené Brown says, is just to lead with vulnerability. And vulnerability is really the only way that we know of saying, here's my vulnerable story. Maybe we don't go into much detail because that would maybe cause the ego to have to show up. But in any way where you can invite that person to see you as human and vulnerable, lets the ego calm down a little bit, and then hopefully you can make some kind of connection with that person. As far as communally, you're totally right. What's happening, and it makes it worse, what's happening is as people deconstruct, the institutions feel threatened. And when institutions feel threatened, what happens is what's called kind of circling the wagons. And so identity markers go up. Identity markers are anything in the religion that really separates who's safe and who's not. And so that goes way up whenever it's threatened. Obedience, toe the line. This is the way it is. Stay strong. Don't listen to those people. Don't talk to those people. Those kinds of messages go way up when they feel threatened. And that's just how, because that's how we are personally, that's also how we act communally. And so one-on-one, we really just have to lead with vulnerability as much as we can. And then communally, there's not much you can do to prevent a people from circling the wagons. The only thing that you can really do is just on an individual level. How can I still relate to these people as people? How can I see them as human and they see me as human? And hopefully that just kind of brings down the temperature so that we can still see and communicate and learn with each other. Otherwise, you just have a group of people who are super hurt and a group of people whose egos are super protective, and that just hurts everyone. And so the only way to do that is through vulnerability.
Yeah, so that brings up two questions. The first question is, anecdotally, what I've seen is if you have, a crumbling of the foundation, the crashing shelves, the dark night of the soul, that the meaning that we're attributing to deconstruction, to get into the weeds, to try to figure out what the meaning is, and so forth, it really can't be bypassed. A person can try to delay it, they can try to reassemble their shelf, but really the pain of the existential crisis, it's not going to get processed without this process of deconstruction. Is there something to what I see anecdotally that people have to put in grief work, they have to put in the unpacking work, they have to put in the work to try to figure out what things meant for them, because if they don't, then they might find themselves in a perpetual status of dark night of the soul, of existential crisis. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and we did this a little bit when we went over Jack Kornfield's book, and we just know that psychologically that the longer you show resistance to something, the longer that pain process is. So if you resist kind of grieving your dad for whatever reason, you just say, I'm not going to look at this, I'm not going to think about it, I'm not going to touch it. You're actually making that process longer and harder than if you were to feel the feelings that need to be felt. Right. And so for putting things on the shelf and trying to just keep it from falling, right? That thing, in any hero's journey, the hero doesn't get their gift or the treasure or the princess or whatever the reward is until they face their deepest fear. And I've really found that to be true with people, that when you have things that you're trying to not look at because it's going to hurt or it's going to force you to change, that's the place developmentally that you most need to go, because getting through that and processing that and metabolizing that and growing to meet those challenges really is the path towards getting through to the other side. And the other side always has gifts. The other side of dark nights of the soul and hard questions and tough doors are a lot of gifts, are a lot of mercies, is a lot of growth, is a lot of joy and freedom and lots of good things that you want. And so I do think we tend to try to avoid it just because we're pain avoidant, humans. But I just know from knowing people and every story that's ever been told that real growth and wholeness, where you really just feel whole within yourself, doesn't come until you face the thing that you're most afraid of. And for most people, they have something on their shelf that they're afraid of. And I don't push people, because those things come when it's time. There may be times in your life where, hey, I'm in survival mode with this new job. I don't have the emotional energy to pour into this part. That's fine. I don't have any issue with that. But I do think setting a time for, I'm going to grieve this, or I'm going to feel this, or I'm going to tackle this question, it's the only way to get the blessings on the other side and to grow as a human.
Yeah, so there's a model called crash theory. I can't remember it. It's a female Jewish rabbi that did a TED talk about crash theory, where people build a structure and it crashed, and then one thing that they can do is they can create a new structure, or they can go back and look at their original community, their original structure, but live in a different way. I probably totally slaughtered what that was, but that was the basic idea. And so sometimes what I see is people who go through a faith deconstruction, they look for a new structure because it provides them a new sense of security. But sometimes when they create a new structure, they just build a new edifice on a brittle foundation. And so my sense is in the monomyth of the hero's journey is that the hero needs to not create a new structure or a new brittle thing, but continually be able to live in the face of their fear. So what we're referring to as deconstruction is kind of an ongoing process throughout someone's life. It doesn't go away, because if it goes away, then they risk creating a new brittle foundation that leads to a future identity crisis. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you and I both know people who, left some organized religion, Mormonism, maybe another one, and then became a fundamentalist for some new thing, right? Whether it be Christianity or energy healing or whatever the new thing is.
Or
And
new atheism,
new
or
atheism,
right,
100%.
yeah,
Atheism can act as a religion. These are my
right,
prophets, right? Sam Harris is my prophet.
right.
These are the people that are in, these are the people that are out. I get to feel more morally superior to everyone, which is kind of, every religion is the true religion where you get to feel morally superior. You get that as a new atheist. I mean, there are many ways that new atheism can act as essentially a new religion where you're not growing, you're just replacing the black hole of the power structure that had just crumbled. And so, yeah, you're totally right. The only way to break out of that system of black hole power structure is to actually face the thing that you're afraid of and sit with it and slowly grow out of it, right? It's kind of like the difference between England and France when they're both monarchies. What France did is they had a king and then they would kill him and it'd be violence, and then a king, and the king would fall into that power structure, and then there'd be anarchy and violence. And they just went back and forth, right, between a new king and anarchy, and it just one fed the other, and they could never really get out of it for a long time. There's a lot of bloodshed. And the thing that England did that was better is, or at least less bloody, is that with each step, when the people wanted something more, the monarch would give up more power. Here's the Magna Carta, here's the Constitution, until essentially the monarch has no true power except for just the stability that they provide as a figurehead. And so, the same thing happens to us inside, that when we feel that sense of chaos, when you're really in chaos in a faith deconstruction, it's really tempting that the first structure or order that comes across you that says, I have the answer, here's the path, to cling to it. That's going to be a really strong instinct. But if you can actually sit with the uncomfortable feeling of cognitive dissonance, and I don't know whom I am, and I don't know what's going on, and face that fear and gather new tools to rebuild, you can actually rebuild your spiritual home in a way that is totally authentic to you and is totally stable. And you're able to, as you're saying, for the rest of your life, continue to do DIY projects without the whole thing crumbling. That's what we're going for when we're talking about rebuilding your spiritual home, is that rather than just move into the next house because it's so scary to be, out without a home and all this protection that religion provides, can you actually sit in that place and say, you know what, I'm going to build a floor here. I'm going to build a wall here. I'm going through my family heirlooms. I don't like these, but I like this. I'm going to hang this on the wall. And as you actually rebuild your spiritual home in an authentic way, with eyes wide open, you're actually building something that will last and that will be sacred to you. You're building your own spiritual place. And yeah, you'll continue to tinker with that, but it doesn't have to go through the bulldozing, rebuild super fast, whatever the plan is, doesn't matter if it matches my values, bulldozing, that's a really painful way to go about kind of building a spiritual home.
So when you're supporting someone who's in those initial stages of extreme dark night of the soul grief, where maybe they had a conceptual framework where if they experienced grief, it's because they weren't faithful enough. If they experienced pain, it was because either God was testing them, or they did something wrong, it was their fault, or it was the fault of others, that there's this desire to avoid this pain. And what you've just shared is it's going to be acute and it will cycle and there'll be a developmental process, but this is an ongoing process of just sitting with that. Like, that sounds pretty devastating, doesn't it, to someone who's in the dark night of the soul? How do you have that conversation with someone who is in those tender moments?
Yeah. I remember, so Bill Reel, one of the reasons that we've been friends for so long, we've been friends over a decade now, is because he was the first person in my life to tell me, you're not broken, you're growing. He was the very first person, right? So at the time, this was like 12 years ago that I had a pretty big faith kind of deconstruction. And, at the time, there wasn't groups like there are now. There wasn't really the internet like there is now. I really, truly felt alone facing these questions. And I cannot tell you the water that it was to my thirsty soul for someone to tell me, I don't think that you're broken, because I felt broken for the reasons that you said, that it just seemed like I had lost everything, and everybody seems to think, I've let go of the path and I've fallen off, but there was no way to get back on because I'm asking these questions and they're complex. And so in that place where I really, really felt broken, someone just telling me that I was growing was really, really healing for me. And then I began to shift into saying, you know what, the questions that I'm asking take a lot of bravery, takes a lot of courage, and it does. And I tell this to people, that the questions that you're asking, most people keep in their subconscious and try to avoid it their whole lives. And so I think it's okay to, I don't think it's prideful to be proud of yourself for asking questions and for doing work that most people are afraid to do. And the thing that you can kind of tell yourself in that space is, it's very painful right now, but these are growing pains. And that kind of just puts it in perspective. Instead of just pain that's going to be forever, these are growing pains because the pot that I'm planted in doesn't fit anymore. And it's going to be okay. I'm going to find a new pot. I'm going to find a bigger pot. And if I outgrow that and that starts to feel, suffocating, I can find a new pot after that. And then you just kind of begin to contextualize that pain, that what I'm going through is growth. And when you look at kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you need that belonging, you need that safety and security. Many people don't have that in their lives. And that's a shame, because you really can't progress to some of those later stages until you have that. Your brain is just going to be too protective of you because of the things that you've gone through. But some of these later stages, when you're talking about human self-actualizing, where you really have meaning and purpose, you wake up every day and you're happy to be alive and you have a reason to be alive, right? The creativity and the relationships of that stage are just so much better because they're just so much more meaningful, right? And so you can just tell yourself in that phase that these are growing pains, and the relationships on the other side of this door get better, which anyone says going through a faith crisis, that yes, I lost a lot of friends along the way, but the friends that I gained, those relationships are deeper and more intimate, and I feel more seen and loved than I ever could have imagined. That's what's on the other side of that door. The creativity, the wholeness, the authenticity, the honesty, the self-love, all that gets better on the other side of that door. And so I think just contextualizing that pain is really helpful. That's what Bill did to me so many years ago, and really why he was such a great friend to me. Yeah, that's what comes up for that question.
Yeah, I mean, one thought that comes to my mind is perhaps that's why resources like Mormon Stories provide so much value for people, because they feel validated when they hear the stories of others to which they connect. It makes them feel like that this is part of an ongoing process, that they're not alone, that other people experience this, and there is a light at the end of the tunnel at some point. And it seems like that being able to, whether it's read memoirs or watch Mormon Stories or listen to other journeys or be in a faith support group or have a pod, of a couple mentors that are friends who you spend time with, and you can just share your experience, is really significant to that. Anecdotally, it seems to be part of healing. I know that when I prepared for my TED Talk, I wanted to express the power of active listening. I can't remember the name of the American psychologist, but there's an American psychologist that did studies that explain the power of active listening to someone who's experiencing trauma, just of the mental health professional actively listening significantly increases to healing from trauma, just that thing. And Brené Brown refers to it using the imagery of holding the hand of a stranger, for example. And so I shared that in my TED Talk because that was significant to my healing, to have other people who could hold my hand, who could sit with me in my grief, and be along with me in my journey. There's one other question then that I have, and that is, my sense is this dynamic of faith deconstruction, particularly in the LDS version of Mormonism, seems to be compounding. Anecdotally, it seems to be maybe 3% of otherwise active believing members, ward and state council type people, very literalist believing members, are going through some sort of faith crisis each year. And it seems to be more common because of the internet, because everybody now has a family member or a child or a friend. Everybody knows someone who's gone through it or who's going through it, to the extent that perhaps over the next 10 to 15 years, there could be, more than a third of the current active believing members of the LDS Church might go through this, perhaps more than 1 million people in the Rocky Mountain West and Southern California who are current members of the church. I went to a dinner the week of Sunstone where Patrick Mason spoke, and I stayed after and I asked him, I said, my sense is that over the next 10 to 15 years, perhaps as many as a third of the church are going to go through something like this, and it could be very acute. And he commented, he says, like, he thinks that that's probably accurate. And then my question to him is whether the institution of the church, the little C church, which is the local church, and the big C church, which is the big institutional church, is the reaction going to be to circle the wagons, to retrench, which is more divisive, alienating, push people away who are experiencing that grief and existential crisis? Or is it going to be, I used the word ministering, which is a little bit loaded because it assumes that you have something that other people don't to a certain extent, but are they going to minister? Are they going to support? Are they going to sit with people? Are they going to listen to their story? Are they going to provide active listening? Are they going to provide them resources? How are they going to react? Are they going to minister, or are they going to retrench? And Patrick Mason's answer was, I have no idea. I have no idea, Anthony. I have no idea. And it's probably both and on a local level, and it's probably both and from some of the top officials on the Big C church level. So that was sombering to think, because not everyone goes through a faith transition at the same time. There's mixed faith marriages. There's maybe the kids go through it and the parents don't, or the parents do and the kids don't, and that creates all sort of these dynamics like you were talking to before, where it's a threat to ego, it's a threat to stability, it's a threat to fears and so forth. So the question that I have is, from what you've explained, what would need to happen for those hundreds of thousands of people to be supported during these next 10 to 15 years, rather than the circling of the wagons that you've expressed is natural for an institution to do? It is the natural reaction. What would need to happen?
Yeah, you ask such good questions. These are the questions that I spend time thinking about. So it's like I'm thinking about something and nobody asked me this question, and then somebody finally asked me, and I get it. I jotted down 10 things that came up as you were talking. So
okay, perfect.
I love this question. So historically, something that interests me is, when you look at what religions survive, especially like thousands of years survive, and what religions don't, because, 10,000 gods have already died. They're no longer being worshipped by anyone. What's the difference? And one of the big differences is their ability to pivot, right? So today you can be Jewish, which I'm actually very envious of. You can be Jewish and be a total atheist, right? Have no supernatural beliefs and still get all the benefits of a community and history. And, there are rabbis, especially kind of the New York area, that are open atheists, right? And they've been able to survive so long because they were willing to be flexible or let go of many of the truth claims that they've made along the way, right? And so the community still exists. The little C church is really what exists in Judaism. You have Passover, you have these, you have a language, and you have a humor, and you have a history, and you can raise children in that. And you don't have a ton of big C church things, meaning, unless you're in, the Orthodox brand, kind of the fundamentalist brand, right? And so if you're in just kind of average American Judaism, you get to experience the little C church without too much pushback from any big C kind of institutional truth claims, one true way, that kind of stuff. And they figured that out. And that's why that they have lasted so long, and they still have a very strong little C church community presence that kids can be raised in even today. I'm jealous of that. I have holy envy of that, as you would say. And so those are our two options. Your option is to become more fundamentalist, which means you have this shift where you just begin to think the world is more and more falling, and we are the only ones, and God's coming for us, or aliens, or whatever, or Jesus, or whatever the person is. And you just get more and more fundamentalist, and more small, and more orthodox, and more one-dimensional. That's one path. Or you pivot and you try, and you can access some of that longevity where you can hold on to the little C church as the big C church may change over time, right? And so those are really the two options. And for a long time, I really believed, like, if you would have asked this question of me 20 years ago, I would have thought that because we have this personal revelation thing, which is or just continuing revelation, that is a huge plus in our ability to pivot. Yesterday, polygamy is wrong. Yesterday, polygamy is a thing. Today, we're not going to do it anymore. Yes, it's more complicated than that, but we can pivot, right? Revelation means that we can pivot. And it's something that I think we take for granted. There are some religions like Islam where there is no central leader to be able to say, we're not doing this anymore. We're pivoting. We're going in this direction. And it's problematic when you don't have that. And so I do think, I used to think there's enough intellectuals, there's enough of this kind of Sunstone dialogue group that are really putting out good Mormon theology, the best of Mormon theology. And because of this revelation piece and a figurehead, we really do have the ability to pivot. I think we can do it. But over the past decade, I'm more cynical now that we're going to be able to do that, because for me, and I've been watching this story, I will watch this story until the day that I die, just because I'm so interested in where this Mormon story goes, our collective Mormon story. The signs of late tell me that we're going in the fundamentalist direction, the orthodox direction, where you just put on the blinders and you lose more and more people. And that's just, they fell to Satan, and that's the narrative. And Henry B. Eyring said something that was so interesting. Someone asked him about growth in the church, and nobody caught this. I haven't heard anyone mention this on another podcast, but he said something so interesting. He said, you know what? The chosen people on earth have always been small and few, something like that. And that's very different than the narrative that you and I grow up with. We grew up with the narrative that this is the stone rolling from the mountain, and we will have exponential eternal growth, and by the end of our lives, everyone's going to be Mormon, right? That was kind of the narrative that we were built with. And yet now we have this new narrative, and it's subtle, but it's there, of we're a small people. The chosen people have always been few, right? And if a third if a third of the people fall away, well, a third of the people fell away in heaven. They were not as strong as us, right? And I just see more and more signs that we're choosing kind of that fundamentalist route of obedience. This is the one path. This is the covenant path. Don't read this. Don't talk to these kinds of people. And really, we're a small people, but we are the chosen ones. And whenever I see religions go down that route, they get smaller and smaller, and sometimes they eventually go out because they're just not able to pivot generation after generation after generation. And so I'm more skeptical that we'll be able to kind of survive. We have too much money now to disappear. So that's a reality too. And so the future of the church for me, if you were to ask me now, I would say that we'll always have a rich core, a orthodox, highly productive, tithe-paying core, especially in Utah, a little bit in Idaho. And we'll have a rich core and kind of a poor international. And that'll be the future of the church, because internationally, there are some people that benefit more from the church than they give to it, right? There are people who, get access to college and get access to things that they maybe wouldn't. And so as the church begins to provide more resources to a poor international with missionaries and other things, and we contain the rich core that has just so much money, to me, that's going to be the future of the church, an increasingly poor international church with a rich core. I asked Jackson Washburn this question. He came up to Boise. We had brunch with him. He's in Harvard Divinity School now. And I asked him this question, or I asked him the question, if you were president, or if you could change anything in the Mormon church, what would you change? And he said the one thing that he would change is the age. He would put kind of a cap on age, because
Emeritus status,
because the limitation that we have is that even though revelation is a plus and enables us to pivot, and we could pivot to some really beautiful places. Someone could wake up tomorrow, the prophet could wake up tomorrow and say, you know what, we used to think that the covenant was this. Now we look at this statement from Joseph Smith and we interpret it as, we're just going to seal everyone together. Gay, straight, doesn't matter. We're going to seal everyone together in Zion. We could interpret it that way. There's a lot of doctrine that supports that. Blair Ostler is really good at uncovering all of that doctrine. We could make that pivot. The issue is when you have 95-year-old people who are continually leading the church, it's not going to be fast enough. And so the thing that he would do if he could change anything, and there's a lot to change, he could change anything, would be to lower the age. And it reminds me of something Elon Musk said. They asked Elon Musk, should we be trying to make humans live longer? And he said, absolutely not, because we should be having more kids, and you have cool ideas and you can do cool things when you're young. But by the time you're old, your brain's already set. You can't really, we're asking these people who have been alive for 100 years to pivot more than a human brain can in a lifetime. They've already pivoted so much compared to the world that they grew up in. And so that just, to me, sets us up to fail. As long as we have 95-year-old men leading the church, our ability to pivot is very limited, and makes me more skeptical that we're going to be able to have something that will last 100 years from now. I think 100 years from now, we're going to have a small, rich core in Utah and a poor international community, and that's going to be Mormonism.
That's interesting.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, in my interview with John DeLynn, we talked about creative destruction and what happens when you get rid of the innovators, and the circling of the wagons kind of thing. And I shared with John, and this was 3 years ago, that my sense is what it would take is 2 or 3 of the Quorum of the 15 with the most seniority to have gone through some level of faith crisis or transition in order to be open to establish emeritus status, and the policy of advancing the one with most seniority to president, extending priesthood to women and having them with equal and authority, kind of Council of 50, or the Anointed Quorum kind of thing. Maxine Hanks has talked about the feminine line of priesthood. And if you introduced women, if you had more turnover, if you had younger people, then you'd be more likely to introduce the capacity to perceive and implement new and more revelation. But if you don't do that, then your Apple computer without inviting Steve Jobs back into it. And if they hadn't invited Steve Jobs back into it, Apple wouldn't be the company that it is today. If they hadn't reintroduced innovation and change, they just wouldn't even be the same company today. And so, the speculation, the Kremlin watching was, well, maybe Elder Holland's gone through some sort of a shift on some things, and maybe Elder Uchtdorf has. So maybe there's like this window of time when Holland is president and Uchtdorf is president of the Quorum of the 12, that they could do some things like end the policy of advancing the one with most seniority to president and establishing emeritus status. Those would be really bold moves, but my sense is that it would take more than a couple generations really to do something. And in the meantime, it feels like the tipping point has already happened, that we're flat to shrinking in the developed world, and we're on the trajectory towards what you're talking about. So
something
really
also
curious.
that something also that Patrick Mason said, he was just on Mormon Stories, is that something that contributed to that, our inability to pivot, is that you had a group of Leonard Arrington kind of historians, people who were talking about complex things. And then when the September 6th got excommunicated, and we really started to put pressure on intellectuals, and Sunstone almost died, right? I mean, all Elder Oaks had to say was don't go to symposiums anymore. And there was only one place that called themselves having symposiums, and that was Sunstone. And so when that happened, he said that it cut out a generation. There was a generation lost of intellectuals who were too afraid to speak publicly, or were excommunicated, or just walked away because they said, I see the writing on the wall. And so when he got, the Leonard Arrington Chair of Mormon Stories, or whatever his title is, he's only 35, right? And so he says, the reason that I have that job at 35, when there really should be someone 50, 60, 45, someone who's published books, there should be more qualified people than me to hold this job. I haven't done anything, is because we lost a whole generation there of Mormon intellectuals because of that pushback. And so it's another thing that makes this issue more complex, is not only we have the Q15 and they're so powerful and they're aging, but then we lost a generation. We used to have that intellectual wing of the church that was at least in communication with the Q15, right? James Talmage, and there used to be there was tension. There was always tension. There'll always be tension. They have different roles, but there was at least some communication, and and the communication allowed the Q15 to pivot, at least gave them that, that chance. But when that whole intellectual generation was lost to Mormonism because of the September 6th, we truly did lose something, and it accelerated kind of that there's only one kind of Mormonism. That's the saddest thing to you and me and other people who have really studied Mormonism, is that there really is some beautiful doctrine in there. There really is some beautiful theology in there. I wrote my book, Mormon Philosophy, specifically as kind of a love letter to what Mormonism could have been. But when we lost that generation, and then the power of the Q15, and just kind of how old they are and how limited we are because of that, I eventually came to the conclusion of just that this Mormonism, the Terrell Givens kind of Mormonism that has some really beautiful things, I just came to believe for myself that it didn't exist anymore, that it was dead now. And that was sad. That was sad, because there was a lot of beautiful things in there that I think are unique to Mormonism that I would love to have around. But some people are still fighting for that to be alive. Some people want to keep doing that work from the inside. I totally support that. But for me, just from the signs that I'm seeing, I have a sense that that Mormonism is dead. Who's going to replace Terrell Givens and Richard Bushman and Leonard? Who's going to replace all those people? We don't have anyone right underneath them. We have some younger people. We have, Jackson Washburn and some younger kids and Patrick Mason. But I don't see it continuing. I don't see that Mormonism coming back to life. And that's sad because that part of Mormonism was really beautiful.
Yeah, and then perhaps the risk is that they do another purge. Are they going to do one? Who knows? It's hard to say. I think it depends on who the Q15 members are in terms of those with most seniority. But if they did another purge, Patrick Mason said things in that second episode that in the 1980s or 1990s would have resulted in church discipline. 100%.
I mean, he said what Holland said at BYU with the muskets, that he was wrong and he shouldn't have done that. Yeah. People have been excommunicated for a lot less.
Right. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But we'll have opportunities to have conversations like this along the way from the outside of the edge. It'll be fine.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind if I share my Reconstruction course really briefly?
Yes. What we did led to your Reconstruction course, and I actually do have a couple questions, so let's just keep on going.
Okay.
Talk about that.
It's not just like a self-plug. It really is. If this is where you are and you're listening to this conversation, I really made this course for where I was 12 years ago, where my house was totally, my spiritual home was totally obliterated. And for many people, that deconstruction just doesn't stop, right? So it's like you're breaking down your sense of self, you're breaking down just everything. And I created this course essentially for a template for how to rebuild again, right? And it would have made that process a lot easier and a lot smoother and a lot shorter, and less unnecessary pain than it could have been. And so what I did is essentially, it's like a template for creating your own home again. So I'm not telling you like, this is the path because I'm this kind of mindfulness teacher and this is the path. It's really just saying, here are the options. What resonates with you? And we start to rebuild together. It took me a year to put this course together. And I'll just show you, I'll just tell you the parts of it. So the first thing I usually do with people is have them establish a ritual. Rituals are just scientifically proven to help us process. That's why they're there. And it can be kind of the way that you just kind of make an eye in the storm and you claim some ground. This is my ritual. This is how I'm processing this. This is how I'm coming back to myself, or this is the time where I'm going to allow myself to think about these things, whatever the ritual is. And so we go through kind of like your liturgical calendar. What do you do? What do you want to do about holidays? How do you want to celebrate life and death and rites of passage and connect with yourself personally? It's really just looking at the system of kind of the heartbeat of your life, which is what rituals are. So that's where I start with people, and it just gives a safe place for the further exploration that we're going to do. And then we do, like I talked about, I think one of the best things to do is really face your fears head on so that you don't have to kind of hide from them, which makes that journey longer. So we go through exploring death and the other existential fears, how to mourn after a faith transition, facing death head on, planning your funeral, guided meditations, really facing life with eyes wide open without kind of platitudes, because there's just a lot of blessings on the other side. When you confront death directly, it gives you a focus on, what do I want to do with my life? That's the blessing that you get. And then we go into like morality and ethics. How do I make sense of right and wrong and guilt and shame and inner compass? And morality is part of the good life. What are your core values? If morality was built on the foundation of God and your beliefs about God change, it's very confusing. It's very hard to make decisions. It just feels like gray. How could you even know right from wrong? And so we get into that. And one of the cool things that we do is that most religions do a story. So like Adam and Eve or whatever the story is, then the commandments. So because of the story, here's the list of do's and don'ts. And then you can move into being. Things like, Jesus or Buddha or other mystics where I am you and you are me. Of course, I'm going to help this person on Sunday. Of course, that kind of ethics and morality. And they usually go from story first, then commandments, then being. And what you can do is you actually, and all mystics do this, all mystical traditions do that. You turn that upside down. So you do being first. And then ethics come naturally. It's a lot easier to not steal from you when I am you and you are me, and I'm connected to that being, right? And then story is the place where we just grow and we play, and we don't have to hold on to them so literally. So we really get into morality and ethics, and let's rebuild that so that you have some sense of how to make decisions. Rewriting your sacred story. All religions give you a sacred story. And now you have to kind of write your own. You give yourself a path. Rats, for example, they move fastest when it's towards cheese and away from the smell of the cat. So you essentially recreate heaven and hell. What does the best life look like for me? If my shadow self, if my worst self were to make decisions for the next 5 years, what does that look like? Because that's hell. And we put that behind you. And now we have a path. And all of these has workbooks and questions and videos. Meaning and purpose, shadow work, really meeting and integrating your shadow. Most religions, your communal self is like your good person or your spirit. And then your individual self that's, naturally selfish, which is totally normal. That's like your devil inside of you or whatever that is. And so shadow work to try to bring that together. Inner child work. Most people, if you've given your inner voice to an authority, it takes time to relearn what that voice is. Contemplation, transcendence, and awe. There's 7 kinds of contemplation practices. Which one speaks to you? What fills your cup? What helps you to feel awe? There's a lot of benefits mentally and spiritually for experiencing awe. And then how to rebuild your pride, your tribe. Who are your prophets and leaders and inspirational people? How do you keep those people in your ear? Building intimate connections, rebuilding your tribe after a faith transition, and then putting it all together. At the top of Maslow's hierarchy, it usually doesn't say this in textbooks because it was unpublished, but at the end of his life, he thought that there was one more thing at the top of that pyramid, and that was self-transcendence, which is becoming all that you can become and living life as if it's an art, where you're just creating beauty and meeting life in each moment. He was studying that at the end of his life, and really putting that together. So you've essentially rebuilt not a spiritual home that I'm giving you, not some path that I'm giving you. It's just a template for you to be able to rebuild your own spiritual home. It took me a year to condense as much as I could possibly condense and put together. And it's the class that I needed 12 years ago when I felt totally alone and had no resources for how to rebuild my life. And if that is where you are, or if that interests you, it's available on my website, no-nonsense-spirituality.com.
I absolutely love that.
I packed a lot into that.
You did. I'm so excited to get a copy myself and go through it. I think that when people go through an existential faith identity crisis, what I've anecdotally seen, what my personal experience is that I wanted to understand what my different options and models were, but I didn't want to be prescribed to that you have to do it this way. And what you've shared about your course addresses that concern. I think that a lot of people have, is they don't want to be told that you have to look at things the way Eckhart Tolle does, or you have to reconstruct a Dan Witherspoon or a Thomas McConkie faith, or that kind of thing. And so I really like that you've done that. There's one thing that I think that's interesting, and in that series that Patrick Mason did with John and Margie DeLynn for Mormon Stories, had to do with the value of the community and what happens after if you leave the community. Do you create a new community? Do you come in the hero's journey? Do you go back to the original community in a way that you don't get sick again, whether it's on the inside or the outside of the edge of that community? And the Delins talked about what they refer to as pods, as like smaller, more intimate friend or book club groups. But it seems to me that one thing that the post-Mormon community hasn't been consistent in doing well is providing that framework for that close, intimate, vulnerable community where the person that will, come visit you if you're on chemo kind of thing. And there's glimpses of it. We see that with Thrive. We saw that in some of the Oasis groups before they kind of died down. But that seems to be one thing that continues to be lacking. And so I'm excited to see what you have put in there with regard to rebuilding Tribe and figuring that part out.
Yeah, that came later in my journey than some of the other things. And really is just one of the greatest benefits of doing this work is finding a tribe that really sees you and loves you for who you are. And when Florence fell out of the window, recently I had a daughter who suffered a traumatic brain injury. My ward didn't know. I'd been gone long enough that my ward didn't know. And I could see why that would be really scary to leave a religious community. There's a lot of benefits of being in community. But I'm grateful that by doing the work of gathering a tribe, I had meals every day for a month, and I had people show up, and people really care, and people who really knew me that I could talk to. And it was like I had built the Relief Society of my dreams. And that is the benefit of doing, that work. And so as far as post-Mormons, you're right. What happens with post-Mormons is the opposite side of the problem. So rather than having things be too ordered, or I don't feel like I fit in this box, right, is what happens in the pews sometimes. What happens with these post-Mormon groups is there's not enough to keep them together. There's without the threat of hell and you have to give tithing and everybody has a calling, and without that kind of pressure, there's really not enough to hold these people together. And so what happens is usually with these groups, and we talked about this at Sunstone, usually these groups do some kind of trauma bonding, and that is really helpful. That's where you get the active listening. But then after a few years, they don't meet anymore, and usually some kind of pod has been created of some friends who really kept that friendship going after the trauma bonding, where you create a little tribe. But the big thing that's missing is the children. And that is the thing that weighs on all post-Mormons, the whole post-Mormon community. That's the issue, is that we've pulled our kids from church, and we've kind of pieced together maybe some good friends through reaching out to people and doing some trauma bonding, and hopefully you're putting together a tribe. I have lots of tools for that. But then the kids then have nothing, right? They have no, and it's one of the problems with Gen Z is that they have no mentors. They have no kind of adults that they respect, and the adults are kind of checking on them. And we know from statistics about loneliness is that Gen Z is experiencing loneliness more than any other generation, just a crisis of loneliness and anxiety and depression. And there's no mentors. And if they get even one adult mentor, that number drops significantly. And so how do we do that? Nobody knows yet. Nobody's done it. I've looked, right? Nobody's really figured that piece out. And so, Uplift Kids is trying to create little pods where you do lessons so that kids are hearing from multiple adults the same kind of moral values. But it's the piece we haven't figured out. It's a piece that we haven't figured out yet. That's the opposite side of the problem. But it's essentially something that you have, if you leave that community, you have to do the work to rebuild it. Otherwise, there's resources and tools and experiences and growth that you're just cutting yourself off from. And that's going to eventually hurt you. Like if I hadn't done that work, like if Florence, my daughter, had fallen right out of the window right after I had kind of just removed myself from church, I'd be kind of vulnerable. I would have needed more help than I had access to get, right?
Right.
So I do think it's super important, but I do think it's something that you can intentionally build, because the truth is that everybody else wants better friendships and better relationships and people to talk with too. And so if you can lead the way with that vulnerability and intentionally build that tribe, and intentionally somehow include your make sure your children are getting the resources and tools they need. It's like piecemealing it together rather than the one-stop shop, which is religion. So if you take yourself out of the one-stop shop, you essentially have to piece this together. So for like my son, who's 11, I have him involved in karate, and there's this great karate teacher who this gentleman who teaches them about, Bruce Lee and personal responsibility and all these kinds of things. And I'm essentially piecemealing all of that together for my children so that my children are getting a lesson from me. They're getting time in nature. They're getting connection. They're getting friends. They're getting inspirational stories like our favorite books at home. They're getting mentors from other adults. But it's something that you do have to piece together if you leave organized religion, which you can, and it can be better when you do, because then it's more authentic to you. But it does take a little bit of work to do.
Well, that brings the question as to what does the secular Jewish community do? Do they still send their kids to Jewish-related schools, or are there rituals and their holidays, the bonding that brings the family together, even if they're secular Jews? Do you have a feel for that?
Yeah, I get a sense, and I'd have to look at the statistics, but I get a sense that, they're not going to rabbinical school. They're not going to they're not going to Hebrew school specifically, but the rituals are there because that religion has been in place for so long. Every 2 days is a holiday, right? I mean, and the beauty about holidays is that, like the Jewish Day of Forgiveness, today is a day where, as a community, we're all going to try to forgive each other for each other's, shit.
Right.
And what an amazing thing. I wish in secular society we had one day where it was just known that when you have a beef with this person, you're going to go up to that person and you're going to say, hey, let's let bygones be bygones, or whatever. And that's amazing. So the cool thing that they have is, because they have such a rich liturgical calendar, they have so many values and opportunities for gathering and stories and the humor and the family and the Yiddish and the meals, like the actual food, that it really, it creates this liturgical calendar, this heartbeat for life, this rhythm of life that's very secure for children. This is, children need that kind of security. But really they get that through their calendar, just because when you've been a religion for 5,000 years, every other day is something, every other day is a holiday.
Right.
And it gives them a lot of that without having to do, rabbi school.
Right. Yeah, my wife and I celebrated our anniversary last week in New York City, and we flew home yesterday on Sunday, and we had time before our flight, so we went down to Little Italy in Chinatown, and they had this big festival where they had Mulberry Street, blocked off. There was police, presence there redirecting traffic and so forth, and I think it was a Saint's Day or something like that. But Chinatown seemed to connect to it at the same time. So it was this really big event that lots of people from the city were going to, with all these, vendors selling food and stuff like that. And then at the parks, like we went to this small park. Well, I mean, it's relatively good size, but they had a couple soccer fields, and they had all these areas where people from Chinatown were playing games, gambling, whatever I don't know all the games that they were playing, but they were all gathered around underneath awnings and tents and things like that. And it was really a community together type activity that I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. And as you were describing what happens in the Jewish community due to their calendar, it seems like that Catholics have that with their saints' days, right? And then the people who live in Chinatown have that with their days too. So there seems to be something to that.
This is where you get into like the work of Alain de Botton. He had a TED Talk, Atheism 2.0, and he talked about how we need to construct secular society like this. Like, why don't we have a Shakespeare Day or just secular people and create holidays like this where we all like, for example, atheists all say, like, I experience awe when I go out and look at the stars, but there's no day for atheists to gather and go look at the stars. And so we just don't do it. And so how do we construct secular societies so we have that, so that the kids have something and our society has something? But the problem is, as we're breaking down religion, we're also deconstructing countries and nationality and institutions and society also. And people who are most paying that price are the kids who experience a higher level anxiety, less mentors, can feel really lost and isolated. And how do I even know what to do? I mean, that's essentially what the kids are going through right now. And it's a spiritual crisis in some, by some measure of the statistics. So yeah, this is the space in history where we're deconstructing, but we haven't really started reconstructing yet. There isn't the fact that there's not one day for atheists to gather and do something. I mean, even if it was like drink a whiskey for Christopher Hitchens, right. Anything, but everybody's so triggered from religion that they don't want to do religion. Well, okay, so if you want to be opposite of religion, and then you're not going to have anything that lasts generation after generation. So it's like as a society, we're too triggered from these institutions and we're too traumatized by religion to rebuild. And so now a lot of our kids are not getting the tools and resources that previous generations have had for that order and stability that you need for first half of life. And that's really the paradigm. That's the question that we're in right now. That's the period of time that we're in right now, is that we're deconstructing to what? Nobody knows yet. Hasn't been replaced yet. That's what makes this so fun.
Which circles back to the criticism of postmodernism by people that are more conservative, is the outcome of postmodernism and wokeism and excessive deconstruction is what you're talking about right now, that's interesting to consider as well. So
good stuff.
All right. Well, thank you. I look forward to future conversations with you. I appreciate you so much. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks, Anthony. Always happy to talk.